The whiskey-soaked piano music stopped mid-note when Rose Montgomery stumbled on the saloon stage, her borrowed dancing shoes 2 sizes too large and her dignity stripped away with each clinking coin that landed at her feet. The year was 1876, and Deadwood, Dakota Territory, had become her prison rather than the fresh start she had desperately sought after her father's death, left her with nothing but his gambling debts and a one-way ticket west. She had arrived 3 months ago with hope in her heart and $20 sewn into her petticoat. But Silas Blackwood, the saloon owner with oil-slick hair and a smile like a rattlesnake, had seen her desperation the moment she walked through his doors asking for honest work. He had offered her a job serving drinks, a room upstairs, and meals twice daily. But the contract she signed in her exhaustion had been written in such small print that she had not understood she was signing away her freedom until it was far too late. Now she danced 6 nights a week on a stage that reeked of tobacco and broken dreams, wearing a crimson dress that showed more skin than she had ever exposed in her 22 years of life. The miners and cowboys who filled the Lucky Strike Saloon threw their coins and called out suggestions that made her cheeks burn with humiliation. Silas stood at the bar counting his profits, reminding her daily that she owed him for the room, the meals, the dress, the shoes, and a litany of other expenses that grew faster than she could ever hope to pay them off. Every time she asked about her debt, the number had mysteriously increased. Last week it had been $300. Yesterday he claimed it was $420. She had begun to understand that she would never be free, that this stage would be her whole world until her beauty faded and Silas threw her out onto the street with nothing. The piano player, a thin man named Chester with kind eyes and trembling hands, started up again, and Rose forced her feet to move in the practice steps she had learned through shame and necessity. She fixed her gaze on the back wall, trying to pretend she was anywhere else, dancing at a proper social in Philadelphia where she had grown up, before her mother died of consumption and her father drowned his grief in card games he could never win. She imagined a different dress, a different audience, a different life entirely. The coins kept falling and she kept dancing, her soul dying a little more with each passing moment. Then the saloon doors swung open with such force that they banged against the walls, and a man walked in who made the rowdy crowd settle into an attentive hush. Rose's feet faltered in their steps as she watched him stride through the room, with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore dusty trail clothes, a worn leather vest, and a gun belt that sat low on his hips in the manner of someone who knew how to use it. His face was handsome, in a rugged way, with a strong jaw covered in several days of stubble and eyes so blue they seemed to cut through the smoky air like a mountain sky. He could not have been much older than 26 or 27, but he carried himself with a quiet authority that made men twice his age step aside to let him pass. He moved directly to the bar, his spurs chinking softly with each step, and Rose found she could not look away, even though she was still supposed to be dancing. Chester played on, but the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Every eye tracked the stranger as he leaned against the bar and spoke to Silas in a low voice that Rose could not hear over the piano. Silas's expression shifted from his usual predatory confidence to something that looked almost like nervousness, and Rose felt a flicker of curiosity break through her numbness. Who was this man who could make Silas Blackwood uncomfortable with just his presence? The stranger accepted a whiskey, downed it in one smooth motion, then turned to survey the room. His gaze swept across the tables of card players and drinkers before landing directly on Rose, still frozen mid-step on the stage. Their eyes met, and she felt something shock through her system like lightning striking dry grass. His expression was unreadable, but she saw his jaw tighten slightly as he took in her situation with the clarity of someone who understood exactly what he was seeing. She wanted to look away, ashamed to be seen like this, but found she could not break the connection. For several heartbeats, they simply stared at each other across the crowded saloon, and Rose felt more exposed under his gaze than she ever had under the leering eyes of the usual customers. He broke the moment first, turning back to Silas and speaking again in that low, measured tone. Silas shook his head emphatically, his face reddening, and the stranger's posture shifted in a way that made the threat unmistakable without any overt aggression. Rose watched as Silas's bluster deflated like a punctured balloon. The stranger reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a thick fold of bills, counting them onto the bar with deliberate precision. Silas's eyes widened with greed, even as his expression remained wary. The negotiations, if they could be called that, continued for another minute before Silas finally nodded once, grabbed the money, and pointed directly at Rose. Her heart began to pound so hard she could feel it in her throat. The stranger straightened, tucked his remaining money away, and walked toward the stage with that same unhurried confidence. The crowd parted for him automatically. Chester's playing stuttered to a halt, and suddenly the saloon was so quiet Rose could hear the coins at her feet shifting as someone's boot bumped the stage. The stranger stopped at the edge of the platform and looked up at her with those startling blue eyes, and when he spoke his voice was deep and surprisingly gentle. "Evening, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect she had not received in months. "My name is James Holloway. I have just paid your debt to Mr. Blackwood in full. You are free to leave if you would like." Rose stared at him, certain she had misheard or misunderstood. "What?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Your debt," James repeated patiently. $420 according to the contract you signed. I have paid it. You're no longer bound to work here." He extended his hand up toward her. "I have a horse outside. I can take you wherever you need to go." The saloon erupted into noise as men shouted questions and protests, but Rose heard none of it. She looked past James to where Silas stood at the bar, his face mottled with fury and frustration, but unable to argue because he had already taken the money. She looked back down at James, at his outstretched hand and his steady gaze, and made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff into unknown water. She kicked off the 2 large shoes, gathered the skirt of her awful crimson dress, and placed her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip firm and reassuring as he helped her down from the stage with such care that she felt tears prick her eyes. "I need to get my things," she managed to say, her voice shaking. "Upstairs, my real clothes and my mother's Bible." "Then we will get them," James said simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to walk into a saloon and purchase a woman's freedom on a Tuesday evening. He did not let go of her hand as they crossed the saloon floor together, and Rose held her head high even though she could feel every eye burning into her back. Silas started to move toward them, his mouth opening to protest, but James gave him a single look that stopped him cold. They climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor where the saloon girls had their cramped rooms, and Rose led him to the smallest door at the end of the hall. Inside was barely enough space for the iron frame bed and a wooden crate that served as her table, but it had been hers. She grabbed her old traveling bag from under the bed and quickly stuffed in her real dress, a blue cotton one that her mother had made, along with her few undergarments, the precious Bible, and a small silver locket that held a curl of her mother's hair. "Is that everything?" James asked from the doorway, too much of a gentleman to enter her room uninvited. "Yes," Rose said, looking around one last time at her prison cell. "That is everything I own in this world." "Then let us not spend another moment in this place," he said, and she could not have agreed more. They descended the stairs together, Rose clutching her bag to her chest like a shield. The crowd had grown rowdier, some men shouting that James had no right, others laughing at Silas's obvious discomfort. A few of the other saloon girls watched from the shadows with expressions of desperate envy, and Rose felt a stab of guilt that she was leaving while they remained trapped. But James was already guiding her toward the door with his hand at the small of her back, protective and proper at the same time. And then they were outside in the cool evening air, and Rose was breathing freely for the first time in 3 months. A beautiful buckskin horse stood hitched at the rail, and James led her to it with easy familiarity. "This is Ranger," he said, patting the horse's neck affectionately. "He has carried me from Texas to here, and he will carry us wherever you need to go." He secured her bag behind the saddle, then turned to her with a question in his eyes. "Where would that be, Miss—" "Montgomery," Rose supplied, realizing they had not even exchanged proper introductions. "Rose Montgomery, and I—" She trailed off, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She had nowhere to go, no money, no prospects, and no family left alive who might take her in. She had been so focused on the miracle of escaping the saloon that she had not thought past the door. "I do not know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I have no one and nowhere. I came to Deadwood because I had a ticket to here and nothing else, and I thought I might find work and build a new life, but instead I found Silas and his contract and—" She stopped, not wanting to cry in front of this stranger who had saved her for reasons she still did not understand. James was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on Ranger's saddle, his expression thoughtful in the lamplight spilling from the saloon windows. "I have a ranch," he finally said, "about 15 miles north of here, in the hills where the grass runs good and the water is clean. It is not fancy, but it is honest land that I have worked hard to build into something worthwhile. I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who is getting on in years and could use help with the cooking and cleaning. If you were willing to work in exchange for room and board, I could offer you a place until you figure out what you want to do next. No contracts, no debts, just honest work for honest pay, and you could leave any time you wanted." Rose looked up at him, this strange cowboy who had walked into her nightmare and offered her a way out, and tried to understand what kind of man did such a thing. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you pay my debt? You do not know me. That was a lot of money." James looked down at her, and in his blue eyes she saw something complicated, a mix of emotions she could not quite read. "My sister was 20 years old when she left home to find work in Houston," he said quietly. "She was supposed to write every week, and she did for a while, but then the letters stopped. When I finally saved enough money to go looking for her, I found out she had ended up in a situation much like yours, dancing in a saloon because a man with a contract said she owed him money she could never repay. By the time I found her, she had been there for 2 years, and the light had gone out of her eyes. I paid her debt and brought her home, but she was never the same. She died last winter of pneumonia, but I think the real sickness was in her spirit, not her lungs." He paused, his throat working. "When I walked into that saloon tonight and saw you on that stage, you had the same look in your eyes that she did. I could not walk away. I could not leave another young woman trapped in that kind of hell when I had the means to help." Rose felt tears spill over and run down her cheeks. "I am so sorry about your sister," she whispered. "So am I," James said. "But maybe helping you gives some meaning to what she went through. Maybe it is what she would have wanted me to do." He offered her a slight, sad smile. "So what do you say, Miss Montgomery? Would you like to come work on my ranch? I promise you will be treated with respect and kindness, and Mrs. Chen makes the best apple pie in the territory." Rose wiped her tears away with the back of her hand and made her decision. "Yes," she said firmly. "Yes, I would like that very much, Mr. Holloway." "James," he corrected gently. "If we are going to be working together, you should call me James." "Then you should call me Rose," she replied. And when he smiled at her, a real smile that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners, she felt warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the mild evening air. James untied Ranger and swung up into the saddle with practiced ease, then reached down to help Rose up behind him. She hesitated only a moment before taking his hand and letting him pull her up. She settled behind the saddle, acutely aware that she would need to hold on to him to avoid falling off, and after a moment's awkwardness, she wrapped her arms around his waist. He was solid and warm, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. He clicked his tongue, and Ranger started forward at an easy walk, carrying them away from the Lucky Strike Saloon and everything it represented. They rode through Deadwood's chaotic streets, past other saloons and gambling halls and shops that stayed open late to serve the miners who worked around the clock. Rose kept her face pressed against James's back, not wanting to see or be seen, until they finally left the town behind and entered the open territory beyond. The night was clear and cool, with a million stars scattered across the black sky like diamond dust. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see the trail that wound through the hills. The only sounds were rangers' hooves on the packed earth, the creak of leather, and the distant howl of a coyote somewhere in the darkness. Rose gradually relaxed her death grip on James's waist as she adjusted to the rhythm of the horse's movement. She had not ridden much in her life, certainly never like this, pressed close to a man she had just met. It should have felt improper or frightening, but instead it felt safe. James did not speak, seemingly content to let the quiet of the night settle around them, and Rose was grateful for the chance to process everything that had happened. An hour ago she had been trapped in a nightmare with no hope of escape. Now she was riding through the Dakota hills toward a new life, saved by a man with kind eyes and a tragic past that made him want to help strangers. After they had been riding for perhaps half an hour, James finally broke the silence. "Are you doing all right back there?" he asked, his voice low so as not to startle the horse. "Yes," Rose answered, surprised to find it was true. "I am doing better than I have in a very long time." "Good," James said. "We will be at the ranch within the hour. Mrs. Chen will likely still be awake as she keeps late hours. She's a bit gruff at first meeting, but she has the biggest heart of anyone I know. Her husband worked for me until he passed 3 years ago, and she has stayed on to keep the house running. I think you will like her." "I am sure I will," Rose said, though truthfully, she was nervous about meeting anyone new. She had learned to be wary of people's intentions after what Silas had done to her. But James had given her no reason to doubt his word, and she was choosing to trust him because the alternative was to trust no one ever again. And that seemed like a sad way to live. They rode on through the night, the landscape gradually shifting from rocky hills to rolling grassland dotted with stands of pine trees. Rose began to see cattle in the moonlight, dark shapes grazing peacefully, and James pointed out landmarks as they passed, telling her about his land with quiet pride. He had bought the ranch 5 years ago with money he had saved from working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, dangerous work that paid well if you survived it. He ran about 200 head of cattle now, selling beef to the mining camps and the army forts that dotted the territory. It was hard work, especially during calving season and roundup, but it was his own work on his own land, and that meant everything to a man who had grown up dirt poor in eastern Texas with nothing but his determination to make something of himself. Rose listened to his deep voice and found herself wanting to know everything about him. What had made him leave Texas? Did he have other family besides the sister he had lost? Was there a woman in his life? Someone he courted or planned to marry? That last question made her stomach twist in a way she did not want to examine too closely. She had no claim on James Holloway beyond his generous offer of employment, and she reminded herself sternly that she needed to focus on rebuilding her own life before she let herself think about anything else. Finally, they crested a rise, and James pointed ahead to where lamplight glowed warmly from the windows of a low ranch house nestled in a valley with a creek running nearby. "Home," he said simply, and Rose heard the satisfaction in his voice. As they drew closer, Rose could see the house was well built and well maintained, with a covered porch across the front and a stone chimney rising from the roof. There were several outbuildings, including a large barn, a smokehouse, and what looked like a bunkhouse for ranch hands. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in what he had built and cared for it properly. Ranger knew he was home and picked up his pace, eager for his stall and his feed. They had barely stopped in front of the house when the door opened, and a small, elderly Chinese woman emerged holding a lantern high. She wore traditional clothing, and her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she began speaking rapidly in a mix of English and Chinese as she hurried down the porch steps. "James Holloway, you are late, and I worry," she scolded, though her lined face showed obvious relief. "You say you be back before dark, and now is very dark, and I think maybe you have trouble in town," and she trailed off as she noticed Rose for the first time. her eyes narrowing shrewdly. "Who is this?" James dismounted and then helped Rose down with the same gentle care he had shown earlier. "Mrs. Chen, this is Miss Rose Montgomery. She's going to be helping you around the house if that is agreeable to you. Rose, this is Mrs. Chen, who keeps me fed and clothed and generally alive. Mrs. Chen circled Rose slowly, examining her with the critical eye of someone who missed nothing. Rose stood still under the scrutiny, acutely aware of how she must look in the gaudy saloon dress with her hair falling down from its pins and her feet bare and dirty. But when Mrs. Chen finally stopped in front of her and looked up into her face, the old woman's expression had softened considerably. "You have had bad trouble," Mrs. Chen said matter-of-factly. "I see it in your eyes. But you are strong, stronger than you know. You will do fine here." She turned to James. "She is too thin. I will feed her. And she needs proper clothes and a bath. You put horse away and then stay out of house for a while. Women's business." James grinned at being so thoroughly dismissed. "Yes, ma'am," he said with exaggerated meekness that made Mrs. Chen swat at him. He caught Rose's eye and gave her an encouraging nod before leading Ranger toward the barn. Mrs. Chen immediately took charge, ushering Rose into the house with a firm hand at her elbow. The interior was warm and cozy, with a large stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and braided rugs on the wooden floors. Everything was spotlessly clean and well organized. Mrs. Chen led Rose through the main room to a kitchen that smelled wonderfully of bread and herbs, then down a short hallway to a small bedroom that looked out toward the creek. "This is your room," Mrs. Chen announced. "Is small, but is private, and is yours. Tomorrow we get you proper things, but tonight we make do." She disappeared and returned moments later with a nightgown and a robe that must have belonged to someone else once. "These were James's sister's things. He keeps them in trunk in attic, cannot let go. But I think she would want you to have them. Would want them used for good purpose." Rose took the soft cotton nightgown carefully, emotion welling up again. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you for welcoming me." Mrs. Chen patted her hand briskly. "You are welcome here. Now I heat water for bath. You wash away bad place and bad memories. Start fresh tomorrow. You wait here." Over the next hour, Mrs. Chen proved to be as efficient as a general organizing an army. She hauled in a copper tub and filled it with hot water heated on the kitchen stove, provided Rose with soap that smelled of lavender, and then left her alone to bathe in private. Rose sank into the hot water with a sigh of pure relief, scrubbing her skin until it was pink and clean, washing her hair 3 times to get rid of the smell of smoke and whiskey. When she finally emerged and dressed in the borrowed nightgown and robe, she felt more like herself than she had in months. Mrs. Chen appeared as if summoned, carrying a tray with soup, bread, cheese, and tea. "You eat," she commanded, "then you sleep. Tomorrow is new day and we talk about everything, but tonight you rest and feel safe." Rose ate every bite, surprised by how hungry she was, and Mrs. Chen sat with her while she ate, asking no questions but providing a comforting presence. When Rose finally climbed into the narrow bed with its clean sheets and warm quilts, she felt tears slide down her cheeks again, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. She was free. She was safe. She was being given a chance to start over. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of James Holloway's blue eyes and the gentleness in his voice when he had offered her his hand. Rose woke to bright sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting through the house. For a disoriented moment, she could not remember where she was, and then the events of the previous night flooded back and she sat up quickly, looking around the small room to confirm it had all been real. The borrowed nightgown, her own clothes hanging on a peg, her mother's Bible on the small table by the bed. It was real. She was really here. She dressed quickly in her blue cotton dress, braided her dark hair neatly, and ventured out into the main house. Mrs. Chen was in the kitchen moving between the stove and the table with practiced efficiency, and she looked up as Rose appeared in the doorway. "Good morning," Mrs. Chen said. "You sleep well, yes? You look better." Come sit, eat breakfast. James already outside working with cattle, but he come in soon for food. Rose sat at the large wooden table and accepted a plate piled high with eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, and fresh biscuits. She ate more slowly than the night before, savoring each bite of the best food she had eaten in forever. Mrs. Chen joined her with a cup of tea and began explaining the household routine in her brisk, no-nonsense way. There was cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending, tending the vegetable garden, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, and a dozen other tasks that kept a ranch house running smoothly. Mrs. Chen admitted that her arthritis had been getting worse and many of the tasks had become difficult for her, so having help would be a blessing. I teach you everything, Mrs. Chen said. Some things you already know, some things you learn. Is good, honest work, and James is good, honest man. He pays fair, treats everyone with respect. You will see. As if summoned by his name, the door opened and James walked in, bringing with him the smell of sun and leather and horses. He had obviously been working hard already, his shirt dusty and his hair damp with sweat, but he smiled when he saw Rose at the table. "Good morning," he said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "I hope you slept well." "I did," Rose said, feeling suddenly shy in the bright light of day, "better than I have in a very long time. Thank you again for everything you have done for me." James waved off her gratitude as he sat down at the table. "No thanks needed. I'm just glad I walked into that saloon when I did." He accepted a plate from Mrs. Chen and began eating with the appetite of a man who had been up since dawn doing physical labor. "I was thinking if you are feeling up to it, I could take you into town later this week to get some proper clothes and supplies. I imagine you lost most of your belongings before you ended up at the saloon." "I did," Rose admitted, "and that would be very kind, though I have no money to pay for anything. Perhaps we could consider it an advance on my wages." "Consider it a settling-in bonus," James said firmly. "You are going to be working hard here, and you deserve to have what you need to be comfortable." He glanced at Mrs. Chen. "What do you think? Could you make a list of what Rose might need?" "Already making list in my head," Mrs. Chen said with satisfaction. "We go to town. We get good practical things. She needs work dresses, undergarments, shoes, coat for winter, all practical things." Rose felt overwhelmed by their generosity but managed a grateful smile. "I will work very hard," she promised. "I will earn everything you are giving me." "I have no doubt of that," James said, meeting her eyes across the table. The moment stretched between them, warm and full of possibility, until Mrs. Chen cleared her throat meaningfully and began collecting plates with pointed efficiency. Over the following days, Rose settled into the rhythm of ranch life and found that she loved it. She woke early and helped Mrs. Chen prepare breakfast for James and the two ranch hands who worked for him, good men named Charlie and Hank who treated her with polite respect. She learned to make bread and churn butter, to tend the garden and preserve vegetables, to collect eggs without upsetting the temperamental hens. Her hands, soft from her brief time in the saloon, quickly developed calluses from hard work, but she did not mind. Every task she completed felt like a reclaiming of her self-worth. Mrs. Chen was a patient teacher who showed Rose not only how to do things, but why they were done certain ways. She taught her Chinese techniques for cooking vegetables that kept them crisp and flavorful, showed her how to mix herbs for medicines that could treat common ailments, and told her stories about her life in China and her journey to America that made Rose realize how sheltered her own life had been. The old woman had survived hardships that Rose could barely imagine, and yet she remained kind and generous of spirit. Rose hoped she could develop that same strength. James was often out working from dawn until dusk, but he always came in for meals and frequently stopped by the house during the day for water or coffee. Rose found herself listening for his footsteps, looking up whenever she heard him approach, and feeling a flutter in her chest when he smiled at her. He treated her with unfailing courtesy, never mentioning her past at the saloon, never making her feel like anything less than a valued member of his household. He asked her opinions on things, told her about his plans for the ranch, and listened with genuine interest when she spoke about her life before Deadwood, the happy years with her parents before everything fell apart. One evening about 2 weeks after her arrival, James asked if she would like to take a walk with him after dinner. Rose agreed immediately, perhaps too eagerly, and Mrs. Chen gave her a knowing look as she left the kitchen. They strolled down to the creek where the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, and James pointed out a family of deer drinking on the far bank. The evening air was cool and pleasant, and Rose pulled her new shawl, purchased on their trip to town, more closely around her shoulders. "I wanted to thank you properly," Rose said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Not just for paying my debt or giving me this job, but for treating me like a person worthy of respect. After what Silas did, after being forced to dance in that saloon while men—" She paused, swallowing hard. "I had started to believe that was all I was worth, that I had somehow earned that treatment through my own foolishness in signing that contract. But you have never made me feel that way. You have made me feel human again." James stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious in the fading light. "Rose, what happened to you was not your fault. Silas Blackwood is a predator who takes advantage of people in desperate situations. You were grieving and alone, and he saw weakness he could exploit. That speaks to his lack of character, not yours." He hesitated, then continued more quietly. "I know what it is like to feel worthless. After my father drank himself to death and left us with nothing, after my sister got trapped in that saloon and I could not save her in time, I felt like a failure, like I should have been able to protect her and I was not man enough to do it. It took me a long time to understand that I could not control what had already happened, but I could control what I did next. I could build something good and try to help others when I had the chance. That is all any of us can do." Rose looked up at him, at his earnest face and his kind eyes, and felt something shift in her heart. This was not just gratitude or appreciation. This was something deeper, something that terrified and thrilled her at the same time. "You are a good man, James Holloway," she said softly. "I try to be," he replied. And then he did something that surprised them both. He reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers barely brushing her cheek. The touch was feather light and entirely proper, but it sent warmth flooding through Rose's entire body. Their eyes met and held, and Rose saw in his gaze that he felt it too, this connection growing between them. Then James stepped back, clearing his throat. "We should head back before Mrs. Chen sends out a search party," he said, with a lightness that did not quite mask the emotion underneath. They walked back to the house in silence, but everything had changed. Rose lay awake that night thinking about the way he had looked at her, the gentleness of his touch, and she allowed herself to hope for something she had thought lost forever, the possibility of love. The summer days grew longer and warmer, and Rose bloomed like the wildflowers that covered the hillsides. Her cheeks regained their color, her body grew stronger from good food and honest work, and the haunted look gradually faded from her eyes. She laughed more easily, especially at Charlie's terrible jokes and Mrs. Chen's scolding that was never as severe as she pretended. She learned to ride Ranger under James's patient instruction, and she discovered she loved the freedom of galloping across the grasslands with the wind in her hair and the endless sky above her. James courted her slowly and carefully, as though afraid she might shatter if he moved too quickly. He brought her wildflowers he had picked on his rides. He asked her to accompany him when he checked on the cattle in the far pastures, using the time alone to talk with her about everything and nothing. He taught her to fish in the creek and laughed when she squealed at catching her first trout. He read to her in the evenings from the few books he owned, his deep voice bringing the stories to life. Rose fell in love with him gradually and then all at once, the way dawn creeps over the horizon and then suddenly it is full daylight. She loved his gentleness with the animals and his patience with his men. She loved the way he worked alongside Charlie and Hank rather than simply giving orders, and the way he spoke respectfully to Mrs. Chen and valued her wisdom. She loved his quiet strength and his rare but beautiful smile. She loved the way he looked at her like she was precious and worth protecting. She had never felt this way about anyone, had never understood what poets meant when they wrote about love, but now she knew. She was completely and irrevocably in love with James Holloway. The question was whether he felt the same way. He clearly cared for her, enjoyed her company, treated her with affection and respect. But was it love, or was it merely kindness and friendship? Rose agonized over the question, afraid to reveal her feelings in case she had misread his intentions and made everything awkward. Mrs. Chen watched them both with knowing eyes, but said nothing, though she often found excuses to leave them alone together. The answer came on a warm evening in late August when James asked Rose to ride out with him to watch the sunset from a high ridge that overlooked the entire valley. They sat side by side on a flat boulder, their horses grazing nearby, and watched the sky turn orange and pink and purple as the sun sank toward the horizon. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and Rose felt a sense of peace and contentment that she had never experienced before. This was where she belonged, here on this ranch with this man beside her. "Rose," James said quietly, not looking at her, "I need to tell you something, and I hope you will hear me out before you respond." Rose's heart began to pound. "Of course," she managed. James took a deep breath, still staring at the sunset. "When I walked into that saloon and saw you on that stage, I told myself I was helping you because of what happened to my sister. And that was true. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth is that when our eyes met across that room, I felt something I had never felt before, like I was looking at someone I had been waiting my whole life to find." He finally turned to look at her, his blue eyes intense. "Over these past months, I have fallen in love with you. Not the idea of you or some imagined version, but the real you. Your strength and your kindness and your laughter, the way you sing while you work, and the way you are gentle with the animals, the way you have built a friendship with Mrs. Chen and earned the respect of my men. I love everything about you, Rose, and I want you to stay here not as my housekeeper but as my wife, if you will have me." Rose felt tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of pure joy. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, James, I will marry you. I love you too, so much that it scares me sometimes. You saved me in every way a person can be saved, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." James's face broke into the widest smile Rose had ever seen, and he cupped her face gently in his calloused hands and kissed her. It was tender and sweet and perfect, and Rose felt like she was finally, truly home. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and grinning like fools, James pulled her close against his side and they watched the last of the sunset together, planning a future neither had dared to dream of just a few months before. They were married 6 weeks later on a crisp October morning, when the aspens had turned golden and the air smelled of coming winter. The ceremony was small, held in the ranch house with only Mrs. Chen, Charlie, Hank, and a few neighboring ranchers in attendance. Rose wore a simple but beautiful dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, white cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. James wore his best suit, looking handsome and nervous as he waited for her to walk across the room to stand beside him. The traveling preacher who served the scattered ranches in the territory performed the ceremony, and when he pronounced them husband and wife and James kissed her, Rose felt complete happiness for the first time in her life. Mrs. Chen had prepared a feast, and they celebrated long into the evening with food and music and laughter. Charlie played a fiddle Rose had not known he possessed, and Hank surprised everyone with a surprisingly good singing voice. James danced with Rose in the cleared space of the main room, holding her close and whispering promises in her ear that made her blush and smile. When the guests finally departed, and Mrs. Chen tactfully retired to her own small cabin behind the main house, James carried Rose over the threshold of their bedroom and made love to her with tender passion that left them both breathless and amazed. The first winter of their marriage was hard, as all winters in Dakota Territory were hard, but Rose had never been happier. She and James learned each other's rhythms, figured out how to share space and work together, and resolved the small disagreements that every couple faced. She learned that he was grumpy before his morning coffee, and that he worried constantly about the cattle and whether he had enough hay stored to get through to spring. He learned that she sang to herself when she was happy, and that she cried easily at sentimental things but was tough as nails when facing real hardships. Mrs. Chen became like a grandmother to them both, offering advice when asked and knowing looks when they thought they were being subtle about their affection for each other. She taught Rose more complicated Chinese dishes and told her stories about raising children, because even though Rose and James did not speak of it directly yet, they both wanted a family. The ranch thrived under James's careful management, and by the time spring arrived with its mud and new calves and exhausting work, they were secure enough financially that James began talking about expanding his herd and building a larger barn. In May, Rose realized she had not had her monthly courses in some time, and Mrs. Chen confirmed what she already suspected. She was with child. James was overjoyed when she told him, picking her up and spinning her around despite her laughing protests that he would make her dizzy. He became impossibly protective, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work until Rose and Mrs. Chen both scolded him into sense. She was pregnant, not ill, and the work still needed to be done. Her pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into the fall. She grew round and uncomfortable but remained active, finally conceding to let others handle the heaviest tasks only in her last month. James talked to her belly constantly, telling their child about the ranch and the horses and all the things they would do together. Mrs. Chen prepared the small room next to their bedroom as a nursery, sewing tiny clothes and blankets with meticulous care. On a cold January morning in 1878, after a labor that lasted through the night and left Rose exhausted and sweaty and certain she might die, Mrs. Chen placed a squalling, red-faced baby boy in her arms. Rose looked down at her son, at his tiny, perfect fingers and his dark, downy hair, and felt a love so fierce it stole her breath. James, who had paced in the main room the entire time despite Mrs. Chen's attempts to send him outside, rushed in the moment he was allowed and stared at his son with tears running unashamedly down his face. "We have a boy," Rose whispered, touching the baby's soft cheek. "What should we name him?" James reached out to gently stroke the baby's head with one finger. "I would like to call him Samuel, after my father's father, who was a good man unlike my father. Samuel Holloway." "Samuel," Rose repeated, and the baby quieted at the sound of her voice. "Hello, Samuel. Welcome to the world." Life with a baby was exhausting and chaotic and wonderful. Samuel was a good baby for the most part, sleeping in reasonable stretches and nursing well, but he still demanded constant attention. Rose was grateful for Mrs. Chen's help and experience, and for James's willingness to walk the floors with his son at night when Samuel was fussy. Watching James with their son, seeing the tenderness with which he held the tiny baby and the devotion in his eyes, made Rose fall even more deeply in love with her husband. As Samuel grew from a baby into a toddler, Rose sometimes thought back to her life before, to the desperate woman she had been on that stage in Deadwood. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like a story that had happened to someone else. She'd been so lost then, so certain that her life was over at 22 and she would never know happiness or safety again. But James had walked through those saloon doors and changed everything. He had given her not just freedom, but a future, not just safety, but love, not just a job, but a home. She watched Samuel taking his first wobbling steps across the ranch house floor, laughing with delight as he tumbled into his father's waiting arms, and she felt gratitude so deep it was almost overwhelming. This beautiful life, this wonderful family, this home full of love and laughter, it had all seemed impossible once, but here it was. Here she was. She had survived the worst and found the best. And she would spend the rest of her life being thankful for the cowboy who had paid her debt and led her out the door into a life beyond her wildest dreams. The years rolled past in the way they do in a happy life. marked by both the everyday rhythms of ranch work and the special moments that stood out bright and clear. Samuel grew into a sturdy little boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, curious about everything and fearless in the way that gave Rose heart palpitations whenever he climbed too high or got too close to the horse's hooves. James taught him to ride on a gentle mare named Daisy when he was only 4, and soon Samuel was tagging along after his father whenever he was allowed, determined to be a rancher just like his papa. When Samuel was 3, Rose became pregnant again, and this time she delivered a daughter they named Lucy after Rose's mother. Lucy was a sweet, placid baby who gazed at the world with solemn gray eyes and seemed content to simply observe everything happening around her. Samuel was initially suspicious of this new person taking his parents' attention, but he quickly became fiercely protective of his little sister, refusing to let anyone but family hold her and bringing her his favorite toys to play with. Mrs. Chen, now quite elderly but still sharp as a tack, delighted in the children and could often be found telling them stories or teaching Samuel to count in Chinese. Charlie and Hank, both still working the ranch despite their advancing years, whittled toys for the children and taught Samuel the names of all the cattle and horses. The ranch had grown substantially over the years, and James now employed several more hands during busy seasons, but the core family remained the same. In 1883, when Samuel was 5 and Lucy was 2, James made good on his dream of expanding the ranch substantially. He purchased additional land from a neighbor who was retiring, adding several hundred acres to their property and allowing him to increase his herd significantly. It was a risk, borrowing money to make the purchase, but Rose supported his decision completely. She had learned to trust his judgment and his vision for their future. They worked harder than ever that year, everyone pitching in to make the expanded operation successful, and by the time they paid off the loan 2 years later, the Holloway Ranch was one of the most prosperous in the territory. Prosperity brought new challenges and new responsibilities. James was asked to serve on the local Cattlemen's Association and to advise new ranchers settling in the area. Rose became known throughout the region for her kindness and her willingness to help neighbors in need, whether that meant bringing food to a family recovering from illness or helping deliver a baby when the doctor could not be found in time. She thought often of the people who had helped her when she was desperate, and she tried to pay that forward whenever she could. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James surprised Rose with a trip to Cheyenne, leaving the children in Mrs. Chen's capable care. They stayed in an actual hotel, ate in fancy restaurants, and walked through the streets of the bustling town like young lovers without a care in the world. On their last evening, they attended a theater performance, and Rose found herself thinking about the stage she had once been forced to dance on. How different this experience was, sitting beside her husband watching talented actors perform a comedy while the audience laughed and applauded. She had been on a stage once too, but that stage had been a prison. This one was art and entertainment and choice. Everything was different now. That night in their hotel room, James held her close and told her that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. "I thank God every day that I walked into that saloon," he said. "I cannot imagine my life without you." "I cannot imagine mine without you either," Rose replied, kissing him softly. "You gave me everything, James. You gave me myself back." "You did the same for me," he said seriously. "I was just existing before I met you, going through the motions but not truly living. You taught me how to laugh again, how to hope, how to believe in good things. We saved each other, Rose." She knew he was right. They had found each other when they both needed saving, and together they had built something beautiful and lasting. The children continued to grow. Samuel developed into a serious, responsible boy who took his role as big brother very seriously and showed a natural talent for working with animals. Lucy grew into a happy, imaginative child who loved stories and flowers and helping her mother in the kitchen. When Lucy was 5, Rose gave birth to twin boys they named Matthew and Daniel, and suddenly the ranch house was overflowing with chaos and laughter and love. Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1888, and they all mourned the loss of the woman who had been such an integral part of their family. They buried her on a hill overlooking the ranch she had helped build, and Rose planted a Chinese plum tree over her grave that bloomed every spring with delicate pink flowers. Samuel, now 10, wrote a poem for her funeral in careful handwriting, and there was not a dry eye among those gathered. With Mrs. Chen gone, Rose took over all the household management herself with help from a young woman named Ellen who came in several days a week. The work was demanding with 4 children and a busy ranch, but Rose thrived on it. She loved the fullness of her days, the sense of purpose and accomplishment. She had never forgotten what it felt like to be powerless and trapped, and so she never took for granted the agency she now possessed over her own life. Charlie retired in 1890, his joints too stiff to handle the physical demands of ranch work, but he stayed on living in a small cabin on the property, helping with light tasks and entertaining the children with stories of his wild youth. Hank remained as James's foreman, now supervising a crew of younger men who did the heavy labor. The ranch continued to prosper, weathering droughts and harsh winters and market fluctuations through careful management and hard work. In 1892, Dakota Territory had long since become the states of North and South Dakota, and the wild frontier Rose and James had known was gradually becoming more settled and civilized. Towns sprouted up across the plains, railroads connected once remote areas, and the lawless days of the gold rush gave way to established communities with schools and churches and local governments. The changes were not all welcome, as they brought complications and regulations, but they also brought stability and opportunity. Samuel turned 16 that year and had grown into a young man who looked so much like his father that it sometimes took Rose's breath away. He worked the ranch alongside James and the other hands, doing a full man's share of the work and earning the respect of everyone who worked with him. Lucy, now 13, was blossoming into a lovely young woman with her mother's compassion and her father's steady determination. The twins, now 8, were still wild and mischievous but good-hearted boys who kept everyone on their toes. Rose was now 40 years old, though she felt younger most days, energized by her full life and her loving family. She and James still loved each other deeply, their bond strengthened by years of partnership and shared experiences. They still took walks down to the creek when they could steal a moment alone, still talked long into the night after the children were asleep, still looked at each other across a crowded room and smiled at private jokes no one else understood. One evening in the spring of 1893, Rose and James sat on the porch watching the sunset while the children played in the yard. Samuel was teaching the twins to rope a fence post, while Lucy picked wildflowers and wove them into crowns. Charlie dozed in his rocking chair nearby, and the cattle lowed peacefully in the distance. The air smelled of grass and earth and coming rain, and Rose felt perfectly, completely content. "Do you ever think about where we would be if things had gone differently?" James asked quietly, reaching over to take her hand. "If I had not gone into that saloon that night, or if you had not trusted me enough to leave with me?" Rose squeezed his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Sometimes," she admitted, "and then I remind myself not to dwell on what-ifs because we cannot change the past. We can only live in the present and build the future. But I will tell you this. I believe we were meant to find each other. Call it fate or providence or just extraordinary luck. But somehow, in all the vastness of this territory and all the chaos of that time, we found each other exactly when we needed to. That feels like more than coincidence to me." James raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "I think you are right, and I'm grateful every single day for that night and for every day since. You are my heart, Rose. You and these children and this life we have built together. You are everything." Rose leaned her head on his shoulder, watching their children play in the golden light of the setting sun, and she knew that she had been given a gift beyond measure. She had started with nothing, trapped in a nightmare with no hope of escape. But love had found her. James had found her. And together they had built a life filled with purpose and joy and an enduring love that would sustain them through whatever the future held. The years ahead would bring new challenges and new joys. They would see their children grow and marry and have children of their own. They would weather hard times and celebrate good ones. They would grow old together, their hair turning gray and their bodies slowing, but their love never diminishing. And through it all, Rose would remember that night in Deadwood when a cowboy with kind blue eyes had paid her debt and led her out the door into a life she could never have imagined, a life that was better than any dream. That night had been the ending of her nightmare and the beginning of her greatest adventure, and she would be grateful for it until her very last breath.